In Daniel 7, we noted about this. We're studying the intertestament times, which is, you might wonder, well, are we studying Daniel or are we studying the intertestament period? Which one are we studying? We're using Daniel as the outline to study the intertestament period. So we studied Daniel as the life of Daniel played out in the history of the Jewish nation. One of the first men taken to captivity, went to that government school, the school of how to be a good governor, was a star pupil with the hand of God with him and his companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then Daniel lived his entire life under the Babylonian Empire, with the very last of his years being in the Persian Empire. Those are the ones that put him in the lion's den. And so he saw the time of the captivity from the beginning of it to the end, and he survived a few years after the captivity ended. And we studied about the people who went back to Jerusalem to rebuild and to start up Judea again, from a depopulated country where it was finally given its rest and its Sabbaths to a thriving and prosperous land again. And we studied Ezra and Nehemiah, and we studied Malachi and Obadiah and Zechariah. Zechariah. We studied those last prophets, and we studied about all those things that end the Old Testament. And now in the intertestament period, as the lesson is named, we go back to Daniel. And so what we'll note by going back to Daniel, and we'll study several chapters of Daniel, is that Daniel, though he lived in the days of the very first kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar saw in the great dream, remember, of the great statue, the head of gold, the chest and the arms of silver, the belly, an abdomen of brass, the legs of iron and clay at the bottom mixed with ceramics, with fired clay. That iron and clay kingdom. Daniel lived in the days almost entirely of the first kingdom, but he's the one who saw the four kingdoms coming. And so, as we study the intertestament period, we will use Daniel as an outline through nearly all of it. There's very little after the prophecies of Daniel that we'll need to look at to get us from the end of that period into the New Testament. And most of that we'll study will be in the very last time of that, in just a couple of generations before the coming of the Messiah. So, as we said last time, and I think we want to repeat, when it comes to this intertestament period, we say that God is silent during this time. So there's these 400 years of Bible silence from the time that Malachi, who probably was just after the work of Ezra and Nehemiah. He could have been just before, he could have been during the same time, but generally he's considered to be right after, not all that long after, usually 20, 30 years. But in any case, after the time of Malachi closing out Old Testament revelation, it's 400 years until we have a spokesman of God recorded as speaking again. Now, there are, in the records of history, there are people who said they had visions from God, and there are people who claim to have some revelation of God, but we don't know for a fact that any of that occurred. And so we can't say it didn't happen, because to whom at times did God give dreams and visions? But there are no inspired authors, and there's no inspired writing during this time. So we generally say, and summarize pretty accurately at least, I think, that God is silent during this period. There's a long period of time in which God is silent, but God is not silent about it. So we're studying what God said about it, even though he said it almost 200 years, maybe not quite that, but pretty close. Even though he said it almost 200 years before the Old Testament finishes, at least 150, God spoke a lot about it, even though he didn't speak during it. So I gave the example, and then we'll move on. Gave the example last time. If I'm going to a play, musical, if I'm going to a Broadway show, if I'm going to some kind of live performance with my children, I might tell them all kind of things about it before it happens. But then what do I do during the show? I sit and I watch it play out. And just because I didn't say anything during the show, does that mean I no longer know what's happening or I'm surprised? No, I still know the show. I know all about the show. I'm just not talking during the performance. In some ways, I think we might compare this period of time to that. God spoke an awful lot about it before it occurred, so much so that we are sure that he is completely knowledgeable, and he even pronounces a judgment of something that's long, we'll study in chapter 8, where God says the sacrifices will cease because of transgressions. And so there's a judgment of God on the people for their transgressions, and it's a judgment pronounced from that incident literally 400 years in advance. And so they didn't have to wonder, oh, woe is me, why is this happening to me? Well, Daniel said it's because of transgressions. Well, yeah, but he said that 400 years ago. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. He said that a long time ago because he knew it was happening. So God is silent during the period. He's not silent about it. So we studied Daniel 2, the great statue of which we just made mention. And now we see in Daniel 7 another vision like that. It's Daniel's first vision. And I'm going to have to correct the writing on my sheet, because in the sheet, in Daniel 7, it says Daniel's second vision of the future. That's actually Daniel's first, because who had the vision the first time? Nebuchadnezzar had it, right? So it's the second vision in Daniel, but it's Daniel's first. The first one, Nebuchadnezzar had the vision. The second one, Daniel had the vision. So Daniel 7 is Daniel's first great vision of the future. The first one was a great vision of the future by King Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel 7 is, we think, about 45 years after Daniel 2. So now remember, Daniel's working lifespan was somewhere 75 years plus. And so from Daniel 2 to Daniel 7 are incidents 45 years apart. But if you work for 75 years, what's 45? So 45 years after Daniel 2, Daniel now, not Nebuchadnezzar, but Daniel now sees a similar vision to the first one, and he's going to see 4 great kingdoms again. And so in the 45 years after the golden statue, did God change his mind about there being 4 kingdoms? No. It's still 4 kingdoms. They're still, for Daniel, most of them a ways off, but there's 4 kingdoms, and they're going to be presented as animals. And each of the animals are going to have some characteristics that'll tell us something about the nature and, of the kingdom of which they represent. So in Daniel 7, we start there in verse 1. So let me get that out. Daniel 7, verse 1. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream with visions in his mind as he was laying in bed. So same thing has happened with Nebuchadnezzar, now happens with Daniel. Now, we know King Belshazzar, don't we? Because there's 2 parts to the book of Daniel. There's the first 6 chapters. You got the Hebrew children sent off to captivity. You've got the golden statue. You've got the statue that's a head of gold Nebuchadnezzar sees. Then Nebuchadnezzar makes a golden statue. Then Nebuchadnezzar is taught humility. And then in chapter 5, there's this king, this same guy, Belshazzar. What happens with him? Handwriting on the wall. This is the handwriting on the wall guy. But that's the last year of his reign, right? The very last night of his reign. This is in his first year. So this is 12 years before that. Now, this is one thing that gets a little confusing in Daniel at times. Why is chapter 5 12 years after chapter 7? Why is chapter 5, the last night of Belshazzar's reign, why is that recorded in chapter 5, but something that happened 12 years before recorded in chapter 7? Why are these not in order? That's right. There's 2 sections of Daniel, and each one of the sections are chronological within themselves, but they're not chronological with each other. So it's divided by sections. Now, all the things that happen in the prophecy part, those are historical. Those are real events that happen in real time, but they are visions of what's coming mostly. And then in the historical part, they're told as the history occurs, but they still might tell us the future. Like Daniel 5, how far does it tell the future? Oh, about the next 6 hours, right? This kingdom is going away. 6 hours later, it's gone. But like chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's vision, that tells history way in advance. So Daniel, just because it's in the historical part, doesn't mean there's no visions or prophecy. And just because it's in the prophecy section doesn't mean it's not historical. But the organization is largely the historical incidents. I like to call that, and I don't mean this derisively, I mean this complimentary, Daniel 1 through 6 is basically the Vacation Bible School section of Daniel. They are vivid stories with rememberable and notable characters, and they are all stories easy to tell. And they just lend themselves to Vacation Bible School or to a one-off sermon, right? A one-day class with activities. Every one of the things in Daniel 1 through 6 lend themselves to some kind of craft or activity, some kind of, and that can be taught at different levels for the little kids all the way up to the adults. And so chapters 1 through 6 are those kind of stories, even when they contain prophecy. Daniel 7 through 12, if one half of Daniel is for Vacation Bible School, Daniel 7 through 12 is difficult and neglected often in study. And if anything, it's saved for theology school. And so it's saved for seminary. Now, it shouldn't be on either case. But basically, we got half the books of Vacation Bible School stories, even though they're much deeper and can be taught much deeper than that, but they often are. And the second half of the book is so neglected, it is difficult, and is so often avoided that it seems like seminary is the only place you get it. I don't know of another book that's divided that well into two very different halves. So Daniel 7 is part of the prophecy section. We're going to look at all of them because all of them give instruction about what God's going to do in this intertestament period. So again, he's silent about it. He's silent during it. He's not silent about it. This is one of the about sections. So we start now with these four great beasts, and these beasts all come up out of the sea. And so we might, oftentimes the depictions is a literal sea. I think it might be the same kind of sea as in the book of Revelation, where you had beasts. Because in the book of Revelation, what do we got? Beasts coming out of the sea, right? Where did that imagery come from? It came from here in Daniel first. And so there in Revelation, the sea represents mankind or the nations. So from among the people arise these four great kingdoms. And so we find that four huge beasts, my translation here says in verse 3, and they're all quite different. And most of them are pretty scary. The first beast is like a lion, but he has eagle's wings. All right. I don't want to face a lion. Who wants to face a lion with wings? He's got the wings of an eagle, but he's still a lion. That would be something mighty to behold. Of course, in so many of the Babylonian and Assyrians did it too, but in so many of the Babylonian statuary, how many times is it a depiction of a winged lion? Right? So these were common figures of the ancient world and often represented the royalty. But winged lions with the head of a man was common in this period. I don't know of any other period in human history where we made those kind of depictions. I know, we make some pretty glorious paintings and depictions of President and General George Washington, but we don't put him on an eagle's body, do we? We don't put him on a horse's body. But they would do that. So we got the lion with the eagle's wings, but then it doesn't do so well. I continued watching until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted up from the ground and set on its feet like a man and given a human mind. And so this great beast is humiliated. It's brought back low. It's brought back to normalcy. It's brought back down to size. Again, these four kingdoms will be the same as the first is in Daniel 2. So this will be the Babylonians. And then there come another. Um, there was a beast that looked like a bear. Um, the bear was told to go devour, and then this bear is fearsome. This bear has ribs sticking out of its mouth, and so it's eating something. This great bear is right in the middle of chomping down, and he's got 3 ribs coming out of its teeth, and he's told, get up and go and gorge yourself on flesh. So just go eat and devour. And so we got the lion with the wings, and then this scary huge bear, and after that we have a leopard, and this leopard is also one who has wings, except this leopard has 4 wings. Now, with both the imagery of a leopard and the imagery of multiple sets of wings, how fast is this thing going to go? This thing's going to be moving. This is going to be a fast-moving creature. And in the next chapter, in chapter 8, when we see this same kingdom again represented, it'll be represented the next time as a goat, but it's moving so fast it says it doesn't even touch the ground. So we've got this noble creature, but scary. Then we've got this devouring and monstrous creature. Then we got this one. I mean, we're not outrunning a leopard, much less one with 4 wings. We got this one that's just quick as all get out. And then comes the 4th beast. And it's really the 4th beast that's given a lot of attention. Suddenly there was a 4th beast, and it was frightening and dreadful and incredibly strong. And it has iron teeth. So it's different. I mean, these others were sort of, described as sort of regular animals, but, with extra qualities. This last one, it just says is frightening, dreadful, strong, terrible, iron teeth to crush and devour, and also to trample with its feet. And finally, if this thing's not scary enough, it's got 10 horns. This is a dreadful, dreadful beast. Now, if you're gonna try and depict that, okay, art class time, it's your job now to draw this beast. Well, the big bear with the ribs in its mouth, I can't draw anything, but people can draw that, right? You can visualize the bear with the ribs. You can visualize the lion with the wings, and you can visualize the leopard with 4 wings. But what's really hard to do is visualize this last one. And a lot of artists have done it. And if I had my overhead projector here, I would definitely shoot you up some pictures, and we'll do that for the recording. But usually this is depicted by artists trying to get all of these parts as some kind of dragon. So picture Grendel, Beowulf's villain there. Picture Grendel or its mother, and so we've got this picture, some kind. And also, people go and borrow the imagery from Revelation, where there's a great beast that's described in very similar terms. Because Daniel's obviously the book of Revelation, those beasts there are drawn from these beasts here, and it's in Revelation there's the great dragon. So generally, this beast, if depicted by artists, is a great dragon. It's a 10-horned dragon. And also the dragon fits the imagery of, going around and stomping with its feet. And this thing has iron teeth. And this thing is just frightful and terrible. And then with the 10 horns, you've got in verse 8, another horn that comes. So another horn grows up among the 10, and it uproots some of the 10 that were there, and then that horn, this is a scary deal. This horn sprouts eyes, and this horn, this Johnny-come-lately little horn that grew bigger than the other ones, it starts speaking. And then when it speaks, it utters great boast. Now, again, this is very similar to some of the things that will happen in the book of Revelation. And generally, the 10 kings are taken to be, or the 10 horns are taken to be kings, and some of the kings are thrown out and overshadowed by this latest king. And this latest king is one who is a great blasphemer here, with the eyes of men and the mouth with great boast. And so then this horn gets in a fight, as it were, with the Ancient of Days. I kept watching, and there were thrones set up. The Ancient of Days, verse 9, takes his seat. His clothing is white as snow. His hair is like the whitest wool. His throne is a flaming fire. The wheels, so it's a mobile throne. It's a throne you can wheel in with blazing fire. From it comes a river of fire, and then in his presence there are thousands of thousands who serve him, 10 times 10,000 before him. Court was convened, and the books were open. So here comes the judge. Here comes the judge, and he's on a great throne. He is magnificent in his appearance. His throne is fire. It's leaving a trail of fire behind him. A river of fire is coming out. I got to ask, is this a day you want to be before the judge? The judge does not seem to be happy. And so a lot of that, again, we would note from Revelation chapter 1, wouldn't we? How is the glorified Jesus depicted? With about half of this description here. And then the throne scene, Revelation 4 and 5, borrowed from the book of Isaiah, also meets about half of that here. And so when we read this in the book of Revelation, if we're acquainted with Daniel, we already know it. So this arrogant little horn in verse 11, he starts spouting off some more. And then the beast is killed that he's attached to, and the beast is burned. And the rest of the beast, they had their period of time. And then one like the Son of Man in verse 13 shows up. One like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him. He is given dominion and glory and a kingdom, so that those of every people and tongue and nation should serve. His dominion is an everlasting dominion. It will not pass away. His kingdom is one, will not be destroyed. So God comes in judgment on these nations. Then one like the Son of Man comes. He's escorted up to this great judge on this, this glowing white judge on this burning throne, and he's received. Unlike that little horn that's cut off and cut down, and he and his beast burned, what we find is the Son of Man comes and is given honor and dominion. So here is the Messiah come before the judge. The reason why we say this is the Messiah is because what is the title that Jesus so often uses for himself in the Gospels? The title Jesus most often uses of himself is Son of Man. And this appears to be the place from which that title is drawn. And there are several times in the Gospels where Jesus makes direct mention, direct reference to the book of Daniel. And so the imagery of the book of Daniel is throughout the Gospels, and the Son of Man title is used there. Now, it's not the only place Son of Man is used. There's once or twice in the wisdom literature where Son of Man is used to basically just mean a human being, like literally the son of a man. I see on one of the windows here, I see James, right? So what is James? Among other things, he's the son of Jay, right? But that doesn't seem to be how Jesus at all uses Son of Man. Son of Man is used in Ezekiel over and over as the name of Ezekiel as a prophet, describing his prophetic office. He's called Son of Man repeatedly. And actually in the Old Testament, that's the most common usage by number by far, because it occurs over and over and over in the book of Ezekiel. And so sometimes Son of Man means a prophet. But in this case, Son of Man is somebody who is escorted to the Father, escorted to the great throne on the clouds of heaven, and who's given dominion, glory, and a kingdom forever and ever, and for everybody to serve him, an everlasting kingdom that won't fade away. And so here in Daniel 8, Son of Man is absolutely messianic. And so, as we say, that seems to be what Jesus is most referring to. All right, so we've got the kingdoms, the four kingdoms, again, not now as a statue, but as beast. Each one of the beasts seems to describe something of the quality of the kingdom. So the head of gold in one is the lion with a man's head in the other, and the kind of, again, the stately and the head of it all, but brought low even in Daniel's time. The second one is fearsome, as the Persians were. The third one is a great devourer. The third one is the one who's a great speed, the leopard with four wings, as the Greeks were. And then the final one is this horrible monster, both of them with iron. The fourth kingdom both times has iron, right? In chapter 2, it's legs of iron. In chapter 7, it's teeth of iron. And so the imagery will get you to the same place either way. Doesn't matter if he stomps you or if he bites you. Well, you're a goner either way, right? You're a goner either way. And so these kingdoms are the same as Daniel 2. If we're just going to study the four kingdoms, and we often study the four kingdoms, don't we, in relationship to the establishment of the church, because the kingdom is established in the days of the fourth kingdom, and we study it in Daniel 2 rather than Daniel 7 most of the time because it's easier. It's a little easier, it's a little clearer. And in chapter 2, you have the mention of the little stone cut from mountains without hands, which grows to fill the whole earth. But we also have, in this prophecy, we have the king coming, who is going to have dominion over all the earth. Verse 27, skip down a bit. The kingdom, dominion, and greatness of the kingdoms all under heaven are given to the people, the holy ones of the Most High. So we do have, again, the same elements, four kingdoms and God's kingdom. In Daniel 7, it concentrates a bit more on the Messiah, about the individual who brings it, rather than the kingdom as a whole, as a kingdom as an institution, kingdom as a concept. But in either case, we have exactly the same elements in Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. Four kingdoms, and then the eternal kingdom that will be for all people, that is set up by God. We have a little bit more detail as well about in this chapter of persecution and of the 10 horns and what they do. But I might pause for a minute and ask if anybody has any questions before we look at that. All right, well, seeing none, just make note that, again, to identify this fourth kingdom as a persecutor with those terrible teeth chomping and those terrible feet crushing and trampling, in verse 19, Daniel says, I really wanted to know, verse 20, I wanted to know about the 10 horns on the head, and then that other horn that came about before the three fell, and the horn that had eyes, and the horn that where the mouth spoke arrogantly, and he got to be bigger than the others. And this horn, it says, waged war against the holy ones, waged against the saints, and it prevailed against them until the Ancient of Days arrived, and judgment was given in favor of the holy ones of the Most High, for the time had come, and the holy ones took possession of the kingdom. So we've got this fourth one, persecuting the church, even to the point where it appears they might prevail until judgment comes. Now, I have to say, when I was a youth, our preacher, he had it worked out exactly who all 10 of the horns were. He had it worked out who the 11th horn was. He had it all worked out as far as which kings of the future, which kings into the time of the Romans. And I think eventually he had the little horn being the Pope. But he had every one of these things marked out with an absolute amount of certainty, which I've never been able to share on any interpretation of this. But I know that the big beast at the end is definitely the Romans, and I know the kingdom that wins is the church. Of that I am absolutely sure. But depending on the commentary you see, or Bible study aids which you use, you might see these marked out in various degrees of detail, where these people have a great certainty about some particulars, which I don't. Now, having said that about chapter 7, it is true when we get to chapter 8, there's going to be a couple of things which I have some pretty good certainty on as far as which particular Greek ruler it's talking about, including one guy by his actual name and dates. So I'm not saying that those guys who have certainty on some of these things are wrong any more than I think I'll be wrong in the next chapter. But you can get into the details of explanations of these that at times I'm not comfortable with, or some other people aren't. But in any case, we know what the general outline is of the four kingdoms of these four beasts and the victory that is in Jesus and in his kingdom. And so Daniel sees the victory that's going to come to the highest one, that's in verse 21 and 22. He waged war against them till the Ancient of Days came. Judgment passed in favor of the saints of the highest one. And at the time, the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. And so all of this was for Daniel, as it will be in the next chapter as well, greatly alarming. And he says it was terrifying, and he turned pale. He says, but I kept the matter to myself. And so he'll eventually write it in the book and let us all know. But at the time it happened, again, Daniel's seeing things in the Roman Empire that while he's still the Babylonian, he's still in Kingdom 1, and he knows the general outline of Kingdoms 2, 3, and 4. And he was concerned that they would be persecuted and God's people would be treated that way. And he'll be concerned again in chapter 8 when he gets another vision a couple of years later, which tells in particular of a great deal of detail of kingdom number 3. And so, again, what do we say? God is silent during this intertestament period. He's not silent about it. And so Daniel 7 sees all the way to the persecution of the church. That's a long way from Daniel's time, because Daniel says these things in about the year 550 before Christ. And that persecution of the church was a thing that happened 50 years AD, even going, for another 50 to 70 years. So Daniel's seeing things 600 years into the future. All right. We'll look at the questions. How do we know about the intertestament period if the Bible is silent during these years? We said we had several ways to know about these years, even though the Bible was silent during them. How do we know? Prophecy. We have the divine outline of what's going to happen. For us, these things are now history, aren't they? When we study these things, what do we call it? Current events? No, we call it ancient history. So we can study history and see how history and prophecy align. We also have, we mentioned the books we call the Apocrypha, which we take to be not inspired books, but history books from the time. And we don't count them as more than that, but we also don't count them as less. We count them as if they're actual history, mostly, because there's a couple of them that are kind of, but also we have that fellow Josephus, who wrote an awful lot about it in time of Jesus, or just after, about these things. what are some major changes that happened between the testaments? What are some changes? That we close the Old Testament and we'll go open the New Testament the next day in our daily Bible reading, and it's a different world, isn't it? And how is it a different world? They did. The synagogue system and the regular reading of many people. Now, they still miss the point of it mostly, which is a grave warning for us. But yeah, they became familiar with the word. They met in synagogues. There's Pharisees and Sadducees. There's all these different kinds of people. There's a new language, right? We close a book in Aramaic and we open a book in Greek. And so actually that's question 3. What was a major change from Persian to Greek times? Greek language and culture. Greek language and culture become the language and culture that everybody knows. And the only people that we study in the Bible that are, not part of it are those who are keeping Jewish traditions. And so Greek language and culture is a major, important change. What was a major change from Greek to self-rule time? So for a while, the Jews got to rule themselves. The descendants of the Maccabees ruled Judea as a private kingdom. What was a change? What's an important change or two that happened then? Yeah, it explains why we have zealots. We have zealots in the New Testament, people who want the Jews to be in charge of their own kingdom again. It also explains why the Samaritans are so all fired mad at the Jews. Because once we study what the Jews did to it was kind of mutual. But the Jews and Samaritans got to fighting each other terribly and kind of regularly until the Jews put a stop to it by a show of pretty oppressive force. But that Jew-Samaritan hatred that's on, it's not every page of the gospel, but it comes up every 5th or 6th page, doesn't it? That is explained by that period of time. What's a major change from self-rule to Roman times? Who does Jesus say to pay tribute to? Give to Caesar. What's Caesar's? And why are there all these hated tax collectors all over the country? I mean, we got tax collectors today, but we don't absolutely hate them, do we? They were, and under whose system? The Roman system, right? And who takes Jesus out to be crucified? Roman soldiers, led by a Roman governor. So that Roman rule and all that goes with it is a major thing that we need to know about, and we'll get to it more. 6, how do these changes relate to the setting of the New Testament? Well, it becomes for us the New Testament world. The changes of the intertestament period become the setting of the New Testament world. And so, even something like Joseph and Mary, they flee to Egypt to get away from Herod, because that's under direct Roman rule. And it turns out places under direct Roman rule usually were governed better than places that were under, franchised Roman rule. And that's why they were safe down there. And Paul in the New Testament, when Paul goes to preach the gospel, where can Paul go and preach and find some people who know something about what he's talking about and can listen? Everywhere, right? There's Jews everywhere in the Roman Empire, aren't there? And there's synagogues nearly everywhere. And all that's from this time. What writings can we use to help us understand these times? Well, Laura mentioned we got the prophecies. Daniel helps tell us about this animosity that's baked into the kingdoms of men versus the kingdom of God. All right? And that, of course, that doesn't have any bearing today, does it? Do we have any animosity between the kingdoms of men and the kingdom of God? Well, of course we do. Always will have. We see that that's baked in from the start. But we also have the writings of Josephus, which, boy, there's a lot of them. But there are some jewels if you if you dig through. Actually, it's best to just find what other people dug through and got, because, man, Josephus takes a while. But there's also other histories that help us and other things. 8. How much of these things did Daniel see and predict? We've already seen he's got the broad outlines, doesn't he? And if you're working on 600 years of history, broad outline's about all you can give. But he's got the broad outline, and later we're going to get more and more particulars. Lastly, number 9, if God isn't recorded as speaking in these times, was he active? If God isn't speaking, was he active? How was he active? He certainly was. Certainly. And Daniel said back in chapter 2, at the first of all of this, God establishes kings and kingdoms and the times and the epochs. So it just happened that the Persians followed the Greeks. The Greeks followed the Persians, and then the Romans followed the Greeks. Was all that just by chance, or was there some governance about it? I think we could only conclude from reading Daniel there was a governance about it, that there was a guiding to it, right? So at the very least, there's total foreknowledge. And I think we say it's probably more than just it's more than just knowing what people would do. At times, it's in the affairs of men on this scale of things, is God making sure that these things happen so that it's all prepared for the coming of the kingdom. The statement in the book of Galatians is, in the fullness of time, Christ came, born under the law, born of a woman. Why was it the fullness of time? Well, partly we talk about that. We talk about Greek language and culture. Well, how come that's everywhere? Well, God says this kingdom's going to come. And so, yes, God is quite active in these things. I think we can say that God was just as active in the affairs of men in everything he did, except for Revelation, in the intertestament period, as he was during the gospel period, or as he was during the time of the Old Testament period. Now, there's not Revelation, so there's with that one caveat, because that's the silence, I think we would say and have to conclude he's just as active in all the periods. I would also then conclude, how active is he today? In governance of the world, in kings and kingdoms, and times and epochs. I personally don't see where there was any change of that under any time. So, all right, that's Daniel 7, and that's the end of lesson 19. Lesson 20, the next one, lesson 20, is on the website for next week.